Hey everybody, I'm making a video game about ants, and this month I've added aphids. I'm sure most of you already know this, but some ants keep aphids sort of like livestock in the same way that humans might keep cows. And they graze the aphids on plants, they actually drink the sap from the stem of the plant, and then they produce a syrupy liquid called honeydew. It's a symbiotic relationship where the ants will protect the aphids from predators, and the aphids give them something to drink. And I think what makes this kind of behavior so cool is that it's very human-like, surprisingly human-like for such small creatures. And I think that's why so many people have been asking me to add aphids to the game for many months now. Here's how I made it. I started with this design. Now you have to keep in mind that ants are very small, and aphids are even smaller than ants, and this is a game where I want to have many thousands of ants in your colony. I really want to go big on scale. What that means is that the aphids are going to be super tiny on the screen, and so I thought that starting with these simple geometric shapes would be the best way for it. I thought that at a really small size they might look a bit fluffy. For their colour, I know that most people probably associate green with aphids, but in this case I decided to go with yellow. Some aphid species are indeed yellow, it is a real thing, and the reason I did this was because I was worried that green wouldn't stand out very much when they're climbing on top of green plants. Next, I designed this nest for them. Now, real aphids don't really have nests in this way, but it's going to be needed for gameplay purposes to keep everything organised and simple. So I went for this pile of leaves design, the idea being that the aphids can just hide under the leaves when they're not eating. And now we can get on with the gameplay. The basic concept is the aphids are going to climb up the stems and start drinking the sap. And after they've drank enough, they will swell up in size and detach from the stem. They will drop to the floor like a little blob. Real aphids don't drop off in this way, but I like this approach because it helps more clearly separate to the player which aphids are still drinking and which ones are ready for milking. Next, we can send in the ants to milk them. This is done automatically by drawing an ant trail that passes near the aphids. Any idle ant that gets close enough to an aphid in need of milking will go and milk it. I'm always trying to strike a balance with the ant behavior between giving you control over them, letting you suggest goals for them, while at the same time not requiring super crazy micromanagement of all of your hundreds of ants. And it's also worth keeping in mind that the ants are quite small and simple graphically, so I'm quite limited in how I can animate them. So I settled on this sort of little jump animation because I figured it suggests rubbing the aphid, and real ants do rub the aphid to release the honeydew. Now at this point I started to feel like the aphid design just looked far too similar to the ants, and it can get a bit of a mess when they're all standing next to each other like this. So I thought, let's revamp the design. Firstly, I went back to green. That's because the green contrasts really nicely with the orange of the ants. And I also made their shape a little bit more oblong, like a cow, almost as if they're walking on all four legs, or all six legs as the case may be here. And in order to make this elongated design work, I had to make another sprite for when they are climbing, so they're sort of elongated vertically as well. And here you can see the new graphics in action. Let's now think about the broader context of the game as a whole. The levels are going to be quite large and dungeon-like, where you have rooms connected by corridors, and the player will have to explore the level gradually and encounter new challenges and new resources as they go. What this means is that the aphids might be in some faraway area of the level, and they might therefore be idle for quite a long time before the player gets there. And I thought, you know, if the aphids are going to be spending a lot of time idle, it would be nice for them to feel like they are living their own independent lifestyle until you get there. Basically, we want the aphids to sort of cycle through their states and for the aphid colony as a whole to remain sort of steady. To make this happen, I gave them a new behavior, which is that once they've finished drinking and they've dropped off the plant, they will then return to their nest where they sleep off the food. And then they come out again as small aphids. This allows them to reattach to the plants, and it creates a cycle that the player can then intercept when they reach this point in order to start milking the aphids. And with that, we've got all of the basic aphid behaviors in place. But I wasn't quite happy at this point with either the green or the yellow design. The yellow just didn't feel right, it was too close to the ant's orange. The green was really blending in. I was starting to think if there wasn't really a solution to this, but then Dazkar from the Discord server had a great suggestion, which was for them to start out green, but then they can become more yellow as they drink and as they fill up. And I really like this idea, in particular because the honeydew is yellow, or at least I've given it a yellow appearance to suggest its connection to honey. And so if the aphids get yellower as they fill up, it's almost like the honeydew is inside them and making them swell up, and you can sort of see it through their skin. I thought that was quite intuitive and kind of cool. Okay, that's all well and good, but this is a game. We need to have some interactivity. We need the player to be able to get involved and do things with the aphids. We already have the milking behavior that I showed earlier, but I wanted to take this further and make it so that your ants really feel like shepherds and guardians of the aphids. So I came up with this barn design. The idea is that the barn is a building that you can research, and then you can build it directly on top of the aphid nest. And what this does is it increases the population cap of the aphids from 20 to 50. Now, in order to spawn all these extra aphids, you have to supply the barn with a source of food. It costs a couple of food to make each aphid. And this is very much similar to how the nursery building works that I showed in a previous video, except that the nursery creates new ants and the barn creates new aphids. By having two different uses for your food like this, I think it might introduce a little bit more strategy to the game. And in the future, I might bring this population cap up to 100, or perhaps you could even get upgrades that bring it higher than that, 200, 300 or more. Performance-wise, I'm pretty sure that the game can handle that. It's more just a question of not making the screen be too insanely messy. So, we now have the ability to spawn a whole bunch of new aphids. And the flip side of that is they are going to need a predator to help control their numbers. The natural predator of aphids is ladybugs. So that seemed like a natural place to start. And I made this design for them. It's a pretty simple design, honestly. Ladybugs are quite detailed insects, and so I found it difficult to have enough space to introduce personality and uniqueness to the design while also clearly suggesting that it is a ladybug. But one nice touch I did add is I've made the white markings that are on the side of the thorax of a ladybug into this sort of eyebrow shape. I think it makes her look a little bit cheeky. I also came up with some other ideas, some mock-ups for things like a ladybug that looks like a fruit, or maybe a ladybug wearing a beanie, or various other things like that. And these ideas were quite interesting, and I think they can definitely be used in the future for some other beetle enemy types. But for this one, I figured it's best just to keep it simple for now. The next step was to animate the ladybug. It needed a walk cycle, an attack animation, and a defeat animation most particularly. If you want to get more detail on how I make these and how I integrate it into the game, then you can check out last month's video where I made a kiwi bird enemy and showed all the details of its graphics and its AI as well. Now, in order to spawn these ladybugs into the level, we are going to need some spawn points, which is a little bit trickier than it might seem because, as we've seen already, these levels are going to have a sort of a dungeon-like shape. There's going to be rooms, clearings really, and little corridors that connect them in a sort of a sprawling maze-like kind of pattern. And what this means is that the simple approach of just spawning enemies from the edges of the screen isn't going to work here. Instead, they're going to have to spawn from these dark sections that are in between the rooms. Now, in a previous video, I built a heat map, which I used to place the decorative leaves around the edge of the level. This heat map basically tracks how far away from the edge of a level each tile is. So I was able to reuse it to place the creature spawns as well. All I had to do was first find every tile of a certain distance from the edge of the level, let's say every tile with a heat of 4, and then I just have to randomly place spawn points on these tiles, making sure they're spaced out basically by stopping them from spawning anywhere that's too close to another spawn point. So now, whenever the aphid nest spawns into a level, what it does is it looks at this set of spawn points and picks a handful of the closest ones. This then creates what I'm calling a spawn cluster, and I can use this cluster to spawn the ladybugs, like so. At first, they spawn in a sort of an inactive state where they start walking in from the dark areas. The dark areas are of course out of bounds, no gameplay is allowed to happen in them. And then once they reach the level, they become fully activated, meaning they can have all their behaviors and the ants can start hunting them, as you see here. And of course, their bodies can be harvested for resources as well. So in this clip, I was actually spawning the ladybugs manually, but we're going to need a system that does this automatically. And I want it to follow some simple rules. Basically, I want the enemies to only spawn in areas where you've already sent your ants. And the longer your ants have been in that area and the more they've interacted with it, the more enemies should spawn there. It's a lot like how Factorio works, if you've played that game. And so to track all of this information, I created a pollution simulation. Again, an idea inspired by Factorio. The basic idea is that as the ants move around, they're going to leave a pollution trail behind them. And all of this pollution then begins to spread outwards gradually. However, to stop it all becoming sort of evenly spread across the whole level, I gave the pollution some viscosity, almost like it's jam or honey. This means that it cannot flow into the next tile until the gap between those two tiles is large enough. This means we get a nice balance between the pollution spreading out and the pollution also kind of staying put. And it's also worth noting here that that viscosity uses a logarithmic scale. In other words, the more pollution you have in an area, the bigger this distance from one tile to the next has to be for it to flow. This basically just helps balance out the numbers a little bit. And with that, it is simple enough to just use the pollution as a trigger to spawn the ladybugs. The more pollution you have, the more frequently they're going to spawn and the bigger the waves will be. And I'm also adding a modifier on top of this, where if you build a barn and you expand your ladybug population from 20 to 50 or 100, then even more ladybugs will spawn, so you're going to have to protect them. Now before we finish, I made a few more improvements as well. Firstly, I gave these plants 2 more growth levels, meaning that they can grow that much taller and get that much bigger. I think this helps just keep the right scale between the ants and everything else. Then I made this seed design, the concept being that these plants will sometimes, when you harvest them, drop a seed, and the ants can then carry this seed to this new building, the sprouter. This then adds those seeds to your build menu and allows you to place them, which is very useful because these plants give you leaves, so if you need an additional source of leaves, you can place more of the sprouts and you can harvest more of them. And of course they also feed your aphids, so if you ever did reach 100 aphids or so, you could make enough plant stems to keep them all fed. In the last prototype I put out for this game, around about Christmas time, there was a compost building that did something similar, but it was just too complicated and fiddly, so this new seed sprouting mechanic is going to replace it. And I've also added a new tool type, crooks. These crooks each cost 1 wooden splinter to craft, and when equipped to an ant, that ant will then gain double the resources from milking an aphid. In other words, it kind of turns that ant into a better shepherd. Tools are something that I want to add more of, and also maybe costumes as well in the future, so that you can equip each different set of ants for a different task. And I think that will add quite a bit more strategy to the game. Anyway, that's everything for this month. I'm really pleased with how the aphid ranching gameplay is coming together. I think it strikes the perfect balance between being true to life, life-inspired, while also being whimsical and fun and gamey. And this is a balance that I've been trying to strike pretty much the whole way through development, but this is the first time I'm really happy with it. So, what's next? It's pretty simple this time actually. I want to make a new prototype so that all of you can test out the features and the new content that I've added since Christmas. There's still quite a bit to do to sort of pull together all the loose ends and turn this into a prototype, but I will post a new devlog video when that's done so you can find out. And in the meantime, if you want to keep an eye on progress, feel free to visit the Discord server where I run a daily devlog showing everything that I do as I do it. And of course, you can give feedback and make suggestions for the future of the game. Oh, I almost forgot. We've now passed 3,000 total wishlists on Steam, which is really awesome. Let's see if we can get to 5,000 next. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.